When a sergeant struck the wrong woman, he didn't just end his career. He exposed a web of corruption stretching to the highest courts. Judge Naomi Brooks isn't just seeking justice today. She's here to burn the whole rotten system down. Montclair, Georgia. On a radiant April morning, the town still wore the timeless charm of the American South. Cobblestone streets curved past weathered, shingle-roofed houses, their thick wooden doors whispering tales of an old world. But beneath that historic veneer, Naomi Brooks knew too well. Some battles had never truly ended. Stepping into the Montclair Federal Courthouse, she wasn't just entering a building. She was crossing an invisible battlefield. At 60 years old, Judge Naomi Brooks, the first black woman to sit on the city's senior judicial bench, understood better than anyone that power didn't reside in the black robe or the cold gavel. True power was maintaining composure in a place where every glance, every tepid greeting silently asked, "Do you really think you belong here?" Naomi wore a charcoal gray suit, the crisp white collar of her blouse fastened with a pair of delicate silver cufflinks, a graduation gift from her mother more than 30 years ago. Each step she took across the marble floor echoed softly, a sharp, steady sound, much like the quiet resilience she had etched into every chapter of her life. The security officers at the entrance nodded politely, but their eyes lingered a beat too long on her ID badge. Part of it was routine protocol, but part of it, Naomi knew, was unspoken doubt. In Montclair, the sight of a black woman in judicial robes was still something many struggled to accept. She did not resent them, nor did she need their acceptance. Naomi Brooks only needed them to hear the truth and to feel its weight as heavy and final as any verdict she delivered. That morning, her docket was full: a juvenile vandalism case, a review session for outstanding cases, and a closed-door meeting on local prosecutorial reform. A typical day for a judge, if it weren't for the quiet tremor within her. A sharpened instinct honed over decades of service. Something is coming. Naomi entered her office, sliding the leather bag from her shoulder and hanging her coat neatly on the rack. Through the wide glass window, she watched sunlight spill across the courthouse square, where statues commemorating the heroes of another era stood silent, witnesses to both the city's glories and its darkest sins. She allowed herself a thin smile and thought, "Today, I'm not just presiding over a case. Today, I'm confronting a habit." Naomi Brooks picked up the first case file. Her fingers, seasoned by time, yet unshakably steady, opened to the first page. A new day had begun, and she was ready. Courtroom 2 of the Montclair Federal Courthouse exuded solemn, old-world grandeur, with its vaulted ceilings and heavy wooden pews lined up in rigid order. Naomi Brooks entered from the side door, her judicial robe still draped over one arm, carrying only a slim folder in hand. A morning like any other, and yet the air shifted the moment she stepped into the room. A few young attorneys exchanged glances of fleeting surprise. Some local reporters whispered among themselves, their curious gazes briefly skimming over her before quickly looking away. At the prosecution's table, a tall officer in uniform, his badge gleaming under the courtroom lights, stood with arms crossed. Sergeant Derek Slater. Slater, 46, was a familiar name in Montclair's law enforcement circles, a man accustomed to brute authority and snap judgments. When his eyes landed on Naomi, a black woman, not in robes, carrying a file, he immediately slapped a familiar label on her: assistant staff, or worse, an outsider. "Hey," Slater barked from the prosecution table, making no effort to lower his voice. "This room's for legal personnel, not visitors." Naomi, composed as if she hadn't heard a thing, walked over to a side table to review a file. That calmness, to Slater, felt like a provocation. Boots pounding heavy on the wooden floor, Slater stormed toward her. The entire courtroom fell silent. Curious glances turned to wide-eyed bewilderment. "Did you not hear me?" Slater shouted. "Get out now." Naomi lifted her head, her gaze steady, neither angry nor submissive. She hadn't even spoken when, smack, The sound of a slap cracked through the tense courtroom air like a whip. Everyone froze. A young reporter nearly dropped her pen. A senior attorney nearby gaped in disbelief. A bailiff by the door jolted upright, but then faltered, unsure of what to do. Naomi Brooks didn't fall. She only tilted slightly from the force of the blow, then slowly turned back, her deep brown eyes locking onto Derek Slater's. A gaze so piercing that the air around him seemed to congeal. Slater stumbled back half a step, confusion flickering across his face. He darted glances around the room, searching for backup, but found none. The entire courtroom now held its breath in a silence thick with horror and shame. A trembling court clerk stammered, "Sir, Sergeant Slater, that's Judge Brooks." Slater blinked, his expression flipping from smugness to abject panic in less than 2 heartbeats. His mouth opened to argue, but no words came out. At that moment, Naomi Brooks took a single deliberate step. She moved to the judge's bench, laid down her folder, and slowly draped the black judicial robe over her shoulders. In that instant, the courtroom ignited with an authority that no one could deny. And Sergeant Derek Slater, who had just laid hands on a woman he thought unimportant, realized, too late, that he had shattered his own career with a single slap. And the story had only just begun. Naomi Brooks gripped the edge of her judicial robe, her hands steady to the point of coldness. The heavy mahogany judge's chair behind her stood like a silent fortress, bracing every breath she deliberately held. She stared directly at Sergeant Derek Slater, the man who had just brazenly assaulted her before a room full of witnesses, now standing frozen, his face as pale as paper. The courtroom had gone so quiet. One could hear the proverbial pin drop. Naomi didn't need to raise her voice. She spoke, low and sharp as steel. "Sergeant Slater." His name rang out, reverberating like a death knell. Slater blinked rapidly, as if hoping he might wake from a nightmare. Naomi continued, each word hammering into him like nails. "You have just committed an act of assault against a sitting judge in the execution of her duties. In front of witnesses, in front of the press, and under active surveillance cameras recording this proceeding live." A ripple of murmurs spread from the back of the room. A young female reporter gripped her voice recorder tightly, her eyes wide and unblinking. 2 defense attorneys at their table sat rigid, as if they had just watched history being rewritten before their very eyes. Naomi tapped once lightly on the bench, the sound snapping through the heavy air. Under Section 16, Article 3, Chapter 5 of the Georgia Criminal Code, your actions constitute felony assault on a high-ranking judicial officer while performing official duties. She turned, her gaze landing firmly on the courtroom bailiff, Officer Carla Monroe, a seasoned woman with a reputation for fairness and firmness. "Officer Monroe, I am ordering you to place Sergeant Derek Slater under arrest immediately," on the charges stated. Carla flinched, but only for a heartbeat, before stepping forward, silver handcuffs gleaming in her hand. Slater instinctively backed up, opening his mouth to protest, but Naomi cut him off with a single, unyielding sentence. "Any statement you wish to make will be entered during formal proceedings, not here." Officer Monroe gave a brisk nod. Slater was cuffed on the spot, in the very way he had cuffed so many others throughout his career without a second thought. The sharp click of the cuffs locking snapped through the room like the final strike of a gavel. As Slater was led away, Naomi turned to the reporters, the attorneys, and the stunned observers still seated in the courtroom. Her voice, warm yet resolute, filled the space. This court does not uphold justice only on paper. Justice begins with how we treat one another. No one, whether wearing a uniform or a robe, is above accountability. No one dared even breathe loudly. A young female reporter quietly wiped away a tear. A young man, standing at the very back, clenched his fists tightly in silent solidarity. Naomi seated herself in the judge's chair, her shoulders straight, her gaze unwavering. And in that moment, the entire Montclair federal court understood something irreversible. Today, it wasn't just an individual who had fallen. A hidden system had been pierced wide open. And Naomi Brooks, the first black woman to sit in this seat, wasn't here just to judge others. She was here to change the rules of the game. After the courtroom proceedings, Naomi Brooks convened an emergency meeting with senior agents from the Federal Department of Justice. The atmosphere in Conference Room 2 of the Montclair Federal Courthouse was heavy, like the stillness before a massive storm. Judge Naomi Brooks stood firm at the head of the table, her black robe neatly folded on the chair behind her. Spread across the table were thick stacks of case files, documents stamped confidential, and a live feed from the security footage recording the morning's incident. Seated across from her were 3 high-ranking agents from the DOJ, led by Agent Marcus Delgado, a sharp, cold-eyed man in his early 40s. Beside him were Agent Lena Whitmore and forensic tech specialist Nathan Cho, who had just finished setting up a data projection system onto the large wall screen. Naomi began, her voice low but steady. "We're not just dealing with an isolated assault. This is a symptom of rot deeply embedded in the system." Delgado nodded, pulling a red file folder from his briefcase. "We've been tracking Derek Slater for a long time, but every time we got close, the evidence somehow disappeared. Thanks to this morning's incident, we now have an unprecedented opportunity." Naomi gestured to Nathan. "Start." The screen lit up with a sprawling web of connections, familiar names across Montclair's judicial and law enforcement systems, patrol officers, prosecutors, even 2 district court judges. Thick red lines linked them in a tangled web of case manipulations, coerced witnesses, falsified forensic reports, and backdoor settlements covering up wrongful convictions. Suddenly, Lena Whitmore cut in, her voice tight with warning. "One name keeps popping up across multiple clandestine transactions: Thomas Redford." The room tensed immediately. Naomi's hand clenched into a fist. Thomas Redford, the Chief Justice of the Regional Court of Appeals, an untouchable figure in the system, and the very man who had awarded Naomi the Medal of Justice just 5 years earlier. Marcus Delgado frowned. "If Redford's involved, this won't just shake Montclair. It'll set the entire Georgia judicial system on fire." Naomi remained silent, but her eyes flashed with a cold, steely resolve. At that moment, Nathan's laptop pinged with an urgent security alert. He glanced at the screen, his expression tightening before he looked up sharply. Someone just attempted an unauthorized access into the security footage archive from this morning. The entire room froze. Naomi reacted instantly. Lock down the entire system, transfer the data to an offline hard drive, disconnect it from the network. Nathan moved with machine-like precision, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Marcus Delgado muttered, "Someone on the inside knows we're moving." Naomi replied coldly, "Then we move faster." She looked directly at the team. "We're no longer just investigating. We're fighting a machine that knows how to bury bodies and erase traces. From this moment on, no one goes anywhere alone, and we trust only what we see and hear ourselves." A chill ran down everyone's spine. Outside the windows, Montclair remained peaceful under the afternoon sun, but inside these ancient stone walls, a silent war had begun. And Naomi Brooks, a woman who had endured decades of prejudice, would not back down this time. Night fell over Montclair, bringing with it a creeping cold that seeped through every crack of the federal courthouse. In the secure conference room, Judge Naomi Brooks, Marcus Delgado, Lena Whitmore, and Nathan Cho continued combing through documents, the pale blue light from the laptops casting somber shadows across their faces. Suddenly, Naomi's phone vibrated. An anonymous message lit up the screen. "Stop now, if you don't want her loved ones to get hurt." Naomi tightened her grip on the phone, her eyes darkening. She turned to Marcus. "It started." Marcus nodded grimly, pressing his lips together. But before they could react, a knock sounded at the conference room door. Then it swung open. A familiar figure stepped inside. Carter Graham, the head of the courthouse's internal security and a longtime ally of Naomi's in past reform battles. He was panting slightly, clutching a thick folder. "I got word. Someone on your team is being watched. I came to warn you." Naomi's brow furrowed, an uneasy knot tightening in her gut. "Who's being watched?" Carter glanced quickly at Marcus, Lena, and then fixed his gaze directly on Naomi. You. The air in the room froze. Naomi exchanged a sharp look with Marcus. Delgado gave a small nod, an unspoken signal. Trust no one yet. Carter, Naomi asked slowly, where did you get this information? Carter hesitated for a beat before handing over a heavy stack of documents. Internal intel, but I can only discuss it with you, privately. Under the table, Naomi's hand clenched into a tight fist. Everything about this situation felt too perfect, too well-timed. Marcus subtly signaled to Nathan. The tech specialist immediately activated the hidden recorder and mini camera placed in the corner of the room. Naomi rose to her feet, her voice steady. All right, let's step into the hallway. As soon as the door clicked shut behind them, Carter lowered his voice. Naomi, you're pushing this too far. You don't understand. Redford isn't just a pawn. There are people behind him you can't even touch. Naomi's face remained still, unreadable. And you, Carter? Are you here to warn me? Or to carry out their orders? A flicker of unease crossed Carter's eyes. But then he clenched his jaw and spoke low. I don't want to see you get crushed. Deals are already being made. If you stay silent, everything stops. If you don't, Naomi cut him off, her voice as sharp as a blade. If I don't, what, Carter? They'll come after my family? My life? Carter didn't answer right away. He only looked at her, his gaze filled with helplessness and warning. You need to know when to back off, he said quietly, then turned and walked away, leaving Naomi standing alone in the deserted hallway. Inside the conference room, Marcus Delgado and Nathan Cho had recorded the entire conversation. Marcus exhaled slowly, his voice grave. We just lost an ally. Naomi returned to the room, her eyes burning with an icy fire. No, we just exposed a planted pawn, and that means they're getting desperate. Right then, Nathan received an alert from the external surveillance system. One of the cameras had captured an image of a black SUV parked not far from the courthouse. A man inside was taking photos of the building. There was no doubt anymore. A direct warning had been issued. Naomi gave the order coldly. Initiate evacuation protocol for my family. And from now on, anyone approaching me outside our control perimeter is to be treated as a potential threat. Beyond the glass, Montclair was swallowed by the silent night. But inside these stone walls, the real war was only just beginning. The next morning, the Montclair sky was painted a dreary gray, reflecting the simmering storm within Naomi Brooks herself. She had barely stepped in her office when she spotted a large envelope neatly placed on her desk. No sender listed. Instinct warned her immediately. Naomi glanced around. The hallway was empty. Marcus and Lena were still downstairs reviewing files. She opened the envelope. Inside was a printed color photo. Mason Brooks, her 13-year-old nephew, riding his bike home from school, backpack bouncing on his shoulders. The shot was taken from a distance, grainy around the edges like it had been snapped hastily with a telephoto lens. On the back of the photo, scrawled in thick black marker, were the words, "Stay in your lane, or pay with your family." Naomi gripped the photo so tightly her knuckles turned white. A chill ran down her spine, but after only a few seconds, she forced herself to steady her breathing. She quickly snapped a photo of the image and the threat, sending it to Marcus and Lena with a short message. Code 9. Activate protection protocol. Less than 3 minutes later, Marcus Delgado burst into her office. They touched your family, he growled. They've crossed the line, Naomi. Naomi nodded, her gaze icy sharp. They think this will make me back down, but they've just given me the reason to escalate this war. She picked up the landline and dialed an internal priority number. The line rang 3 times before connecting. This is Judge Naomi Brooks. I'm requesting an emergency meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office in Savannah. Include DOJ and Homeland Security representatives. Threat level, priority 1. There was no hesitation on the other end. A brisk female voice confirmed. Meeting scheduled. Escort vehicle arriving in 30 minutes. Naomi hung up and turned to Marcus. Start evacuating Mason and my sister to a secure location. Absolutely no use of public electronic channels. Marcus nodded and rushed out. Lena Whitmore entered moments later, laptop in hand. "Naomi, I just checked the surveillance logs. Tracking signals started 3 days ago. They're not just watching. They've built a full network around your family." Naomi closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them, her gaze had hardened into something razor-sharp and unbreakable. "Good," she said firmly. "They think they've cornered me. They forgot, a cornered animal fights hardest." An hour later, an armored federal motorcade pulled up to the courthouse. Naomi stepped outside, her black and silver hair pulled into a tight knot, her dark gray suit cutting a silhouette sharp as steel. Federal security agents surrounded her, guiding her toward the lead vehicle. Montclair's media had already begun to stir. A few photographers raised their cameras, frantically snapping shots. Capturing the moment, Judge Naomi Brooks didn't retreat, but advanced like a general marching to war. From the top steps of the courthouse, Naomi paused briefly. She turned her head back to the building where she had fought for over 2 decades. She whispered to herself, a vow carried by the morning breeze. "All right, you declared war. Now watch how I clean house." And she marched forward into a battle where not just her career, but the very lives of those she loved were now on the line. Just 2 hours after Naomi Brooks entered the U.S. Attorney's office, the counterstrike plan was already taking form. The first thing she did, even before the press conference, was to secure her family. Mason and her sister, Evelyn Brooks, were immediately relocated by a tactical team to a safe house outside Savannah, assigned a unique code name, and placed under the Federal Witness Protection Network. A 3-layer rotating security team, operating 24/7, was established without delay. Naomi personally selected a special guardian for Mason, Agent Marcus Delgado, the one person she trusted without question. Only after ensuring her family's absolute safety did Naomi return to the battlefield. That afternoon, an urgent press release was issued from the Montclair Federal Courthouse headquarters. Judge Naomi Brooks has officially requested a comprehensive reinvestigation into all cases involving Sergeant Derek Slater and other high-ranking law enforcement officials in Montclair over the past 15 years. But that wasn't all. Naomi had carefully laid a trap. She announced the organization of a 2-day public hearing, inviting all senior personnel within Montclair's judicial and police system to attend and share constructive perspectives to protect the reputation of the profession. At the hearing, Naomi allowed defense attorneys, witnesses, and even certain officials to speak freely in order to offer their explanations. Quietly, however, she had coordinated with the federal internal team to record and document the entire session. And just as Naomi had anticipated, in their panic and overconfidence in their remaining influence, some individuals willingly walked into the trap, admitting to improper relationships, secret deals with Slater, or carelessly revealing past acts of evidence suppression. The public notice clearly stated, all statements made during the hearing will be recorded and incorporated into the federal investigation record. The trap was set. Anyone naive or arrogant enough to share would end up exposing themselves under hundreds of federal cameras and recorders. When the day of the hearing arrived, Montclair was abuzz. Journalists, media outlets, and human rights organizations swarmed the courthouse steps. Naomi appeared at precisely 8:30 a.m., clad in a crisp navy blue suit, walking with the steady, commanding stride of a general leading her forces into battle. Inside, city officials packed the rows. Many faces Naomi remembered bowing politely when she was first appointed. Now, their eyes were wary, suspicious. Amid the storm, Derek Slater, the man Naomi had ordered arrested during the first court session for assaulting a judge, was brought to the hearing as a key witness. Naomi stepped to the podium. She didn't need the gavel. Her voice alone commanded the entire room into absolute silence. Today, we are not merely investigating one individual. We are casting light upon an entire system. I will not judge anyone on the grounds of personal emotions. I stand on the ground of justice. She paused, her gaze slicing through the crowd like a blade. Anyone who aided, abetted, or turned a blind eye will be held accountable. Below, many faces began to change color. A few wiped sweat from their brows. A few inched closer to the doors, as if preparing to bolt. Naomi gave a silent nod. The trap was beginning to tighten. That afternoon, one witness after another was called to testify. With every shaky answer and every hesitant reply, federal agents quietly took notes, and cameras silently captured every darting glance and averted gaze. Slater was summoned to the stand. He was forced to admit to evidence tampering in 3 cases from 2016. A prosecutor, his hands trembling, had to confess that he had received instructions from superiors to turn a blind eye to police misconduct. By now, Slater had completely lost his composure. His face flushed red, his eyes burning with rage. Slater suddenly stood up in the middle of the courtroom and shouted, "You think you can smear me? I won't go down without a fight." In the chaos, Slater attempted to intimidate witnesses and disrupt the proceedings. Special security forces immediately subdued him on the spot, in full view of the entire press corps and public audience. He was swiftly transferred to a high-security holding facility, officially reclassified from a witness to a primary defendant in the organized crime investigation sweeping through Montclair. For a moment, the air inside the courtroom felt frozen. Montclair was starting to tremble. Naomi didn't have to raise her voice. It was the corrupt system itself that, under the searing light of public exposure, was beginning to crumble, piece by piece, right before her eyes. By Monday morning, news of the upheaval exploded like a bomb across Montclair. Headlines screamed in bold letters. Mass arrests at Montclair County Courthouse. Judges, police chiefs, prosecutors fall together. The first to fall was Sergeant Derek Slater. Immediately after the public hearing, a federal arrest warrant was signed. Slater was handcuffed in front of dozens of reporters and local residents, charged with assault, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. As federal agents led him down the courthouse hallway, Naomi Brooks stood firm, her gaze unwavering. Slater glanced back at her, no longer with the defiant glare of a man accustomed to abusing his power, but with the hollow, defeated eyes of someone who knew it was over. But this was only the beginning. That same night, a series of search warrants and arrest orders were executed simultaneously across Montclair. Prosecutor Andrew Mallory, who had repeatedly found insufficient evidence to prosecute Slater, was handcuffed right at the county office. Carter Graham, head of internal security at the Montclair courthouse, was arrested for destroying evidence and aiding years-long abuses of power. Judge Ernest Whitcomb, who had presided over numerous questionable trials, was charged with illegally interfering with court proceedings and secretly accepting bribes from connected organizations. Thomas Redford, chief judge of the Regional Court of Appeals, wasn't spared either. He was accused of repeatedly using his authority to block internal investigations into Slater and his associates. The indictments stretched over 200 pages, laying bare a corrupt network that had manipulated Montclair for nearly 2 decades. A network once thought untouchable, now collapsing under the relentless light of justice Naomi Brooks had ignited. Television broadcasts showed live footage of once powerful figures being escorted down the same courthouse hallways they once strode through with their heads held high. On social media, images of polished handcuffs locked around the wrists of those once known as the guardians of the law spread like wildfire. Hashtag Operation Clean Slate. Hashtag Justice in Montclair. Hashtag Naomi Brooks for the people. These hashtags flashed across every platform. Inside the federal operations room, Naomi Brooks sat across from the investigative team. On the large board hanging in the center of the room, a sprawling network of red strings connected photos of the arrested, police officers, prosecutors, judges, and well-connected businessmen. Marcus Delgado, lead federal investigator, stood before the board, his gaze heavy. "We thought we'd only be able to peel away a few cases. But thanks to you, Judge Brooks, we've exposed an entire system." Naomi simply nodded. She didn't need praise. True victory wasn't about taking down a few individuals. It was about exposing an entire machine. As the meeting ended, Naomi stepped out onto the balcony, where the Montclair sunset bathed the courthouse's worn stone steps in golden light. People had gathered below, not to protest, not to jeer, but to applaud. Some held up handwritten signs. Justice belongs to those who dare to stand up. Thank you, Naomi Brooks. Standing amidst the crowd, Naomi Brooks felt something heavy inside her finally begin to dissolve. Montclair, the city that once tried to suffocate her, was now coming back to life. Not because of her, but because of the courage she had sparked. Montclair had never seen a press conference this large. On the courthouse steps, under the fading golden sunlight, Naomi Brooks stood tall among a sea of cameras and hundreds of expectant eyes. She wore a deep navy suit, simple, unadorned, with a small, gleaming justice scales pin catching the late afternoon light. Carter Hale, the young chief judge and once her loyal ally, stood quietly at her side. Naomi scanned the crowd. The faces of everyday citizens, the ones once abandoned by the system, now standing here with her. She took a deep breath. Today, I am here to make an official announcement. The clicking of cameras erupted all at once. I will be submitting my resignation as senior judge of Montclair's High Court, effective after next week's council meeting. A ripple of shock moved through the gathered crowd. Naomi lifted her gaze, unwavering, resolute. I have completed the mission I set for myself, to expose the rot, to give true reform a chance to take root. But I also understand that for change to endure, it needs new hands, hearts unburdened by the scars I have accumulated throughout my lifetime. She paused, her voice steady but softer. Being a judge was never the final goal. Justice does not reside in titles. It lives in actions, in the hard choices we make, even when no one is there to cheer us on. A reporter raised a hand. Aren't you concerned that resigning might be seen as admitting defeat? Naomi smiled, a smile both bittersweet and proud. Defeat is not in stepping away. Defeat is in clinging to power when it no longer serves a higher purpose. I was never here to be a symbol. I was here to ignite a movement, and now it needs more than just me. At that moment, Carter Hale stepped forward, raising a document, a list of new nominees for the judgeship, all committed to pursuing a fair justice system. Naomi turned to him, giving a slight nod. As she descended the courthouse steps, a wave of applause rose, no longer scattered or uncertain, but united, strong, and full of solemn respect. At the far edge of the courthouse grounds, young Mason, Naomi's grandson, stood quietly with his mother. Naomi walked toward him and knelt down. "Do you see it, Mason?" she said softly. "The greatest victory isn't standing on the highest platform for the longest time. It's knowing when to step down so others can rise." Mason gripped her hand tightly, his eyes shimmering with emotion. Naomi Brooks no longer needed a seat of power to keep fighting. She had planted the seed, and now the next generation would make it bloom. 1 week after the press conference, Montclair was entering a new era. The brass nameplate outside the Montclair High Court had been replaced, gleaming in the sunlight. Justice for all citizens, no one above the law. But Naomi Brooks, the woman who had sparked that reform, no longer walked those marble halls. She had returned to Havenfield, a small town where ancient oak trees shaded the winding roads leading back to her familiar red-roofed home. The place where her family had waited during the long years she fought within the cold walls of power. That afternoon, Naomi sat on the porch swing, a steaming cup of mint tea in hand. Beside her, Mason animatedly recounted school soccer games, his face glowing in the golden sunset. Naomi smiled, a smile no longer burdened by courtrooms, conspiracies, or scrutinizing eyes. Only pure, simple joy remained. Carter Hale had kept his promise. He and a group of young, determined judges continued the painstaking process of reopening old cases. The once proud underground network of power was crumbling, not through rage, but by the steady flame of truth Naomi had patiently kindled. The newspapers still occasionally mention her as a silent hero, but Naomi needed no flashy headlines. She knew true victory wasn't in applause. It was in a young black child standing before a court and being heard, just like anyone else. It was a young judge signing a ruling free from pressure or prejudice. It was in the fact that, for the first time in generations, Montclair's laws were finally serving true justice. As the sun dipped behind the rows of red-roofed houses, Naomi leaned back against the swing. She knew she had made the right choice. No chants, no parades, only a quiet, lasting legacy. A justice system built on truth and courage. She gently held Mason's hand, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon, where better things were quietly taking shape. And that was enough.